Hey nerds. So, going to talk about Rupert Sheldrake here, explaining panpsychism. And Rupert Sheldrake, I thought he was a philosopher, but he's not actually a philosopher. I double checked that, and he's an author and parapsychology researcher. And according to him, he's a biologist, but I can't find any information to back that up. And he apparently founded this idea of morphic resonance, and it's connected to how he explains panpsychism. So we'll get into that. But I remember hearing about this guy back when I was a militant atheist, paying so much attention to people like the so-called Four Horsemen, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, and they were always criticizing this guy and debating with him and stuff. So I had that, militant atheist bias that he was just like a pseudoscientist with who didn't respect materialistic science. And I would say that, this idea of morphic resonance and that kind of shit is pseudoscience, but it's philosophically interesting, although it's kind of oversimplified in comparison to other options in terms of the philosophy of consciousness. But anyway, let's get into the clip.
If the whole universe is made of unconscious matter, how come we're conscious? We ought not to be if everything's unconscious. And some philosophers say, well, the brain...
Well, can't unconscious matter create conscious beings? Like, he's making this a priori assumption in this statement that in order to create conscious beings, conscious beings need to be constructed of conscious matter. But I don't know how this works scientifically in terms of physics, but obviously matter that is not conscious ends up eventually creating conscious beings in the form of humans through billions of years of evolution. And he knows how evolution works. So that right there just shows that the premise of his question is an incorrect assumption. But again, he gets into it more.
Does all these things physically, and consciousness is an epiphenomenon. It doesn't do anything. Others say that consciousness is an illusion produced by the brain.
And that's something like someone, like the first one is something like someone like Daniel Dennett said that consciousness isn't even real. And then someone like Sam Harris would say that the consciousness is an illusion, or he would say free will is an illusion too, which is a separate subject, but somewhat related. But anyway, I'm going to go back to how he explains that exactly here.
But then their critics point as an illusion produced by the brain. But then their critics point out that doesn't really answer it because illusion is a mode of consciousness. So you'll simply...
So he's talking about critics in terms of people who support his side of the argument, but that doesn't mean that is illusion a type of consciousness? That's an interesting question. He's also making this a priori assumption that illusion is a form of consciousness. Is it? Like, if you're being deluded and your brain is deluding you into doing that, is that a form of consciousness, or is that an activity that your brain does? And if he's saying that, then is he also implying that consciousness is just an activity that your brain does? Which, if that's supporting his argument, actually kind of disproves his own argument. But he goes on to explain how these different types of examples compare here.
Explaining illusion is a mode of consciousness. So you're simply explaining consciousness in terms of consciousness. That's why it's called the hard problem.
Yeah.
There's been very little progress.
Because if you try to explain consciousness, it ends up being a tautology. When you try to explain it, it's consciousness because you're using consciousness to define consciousness. It's just circular logic, too.
The philosophy of mind about this problem until recently with the development of panpsychism. And panpsychism is...
By recently, he means decades and decades ago, like in the 60s, I think.
Primarily fashionable within philosophy of mind, surprisingly fashionable, even though it's very similar to ancient animistic worldviews we're all supposed to have grown out of. Panpsychism was really put forward originally by Galen Strawson and has been elaborated by people like Philip Goff, who's spoken here at this festival, in order to solve the hard problem. And what they say is, well, there's a little bit of consciousness inside electrons and atoms, and a little bit more in molecules, a bit more in cells, a bit more in tissues and organs. And then by the time you get to brains, it's a difference of degree. More consciousness emerges in brains, but it's not something completely new appearing from a totally unconscious universe. It's a difference of degree.
So, like that doesn't really make sense. Would that mean that the entire evolution of consciousness from the Big Bang until the existence of human beings, that means that when there was nothing, when the universe was nothing, assuming that this theory of the universe is correct, then the universe was conscious, but it had the lowest amount of consciousness, and then we evolved all the way to the point that we are the maximum amount of consciousness in the form of conscious beings? Or like, does that mean that there's always consciousness? And in terms of just the looking at consciousness items in terms of a consciousness scale, like, like this wall behind me, that's how much consciousness does that have? How do we quantify this? Is it like a 1 out of 10 in consciousness? If there's something that is the maximum amount of consciousness, like human consciousness, for example, perhaps, then is there something that has the maximum amount of consciousness? Is there something that also has the minimum amount of consciousness, meaning is there something that has no consciousness? Or in this scale, does every is it kind of seems like he was saying that everything has some degree of consciousness, and something has the or he was implying that something has the absolute minimum amount of consciousness and something has the absolute maximum amount of consciousness. So, like, again, though, like, scientifically speaking, it's kind of pseudoscientific, because it's it's almost impossible to disprove, and scientific experiments have been done that have sometimes shown results that seem to show uh, that objects are psychic. But again, this just leads to the replication crisis. Are these peer reviewed, replicated, and placebo controlled trials that have, stood up to scientific muster and further in scientific investigation? And pretty much never ends up being the case that there's anything to this stuff, you know like conscious objects, psychics, telekinesis, all that kind of stuff, or that kind of crap, I would say. But anyway, yeah, even though I don't think there's that much merit to it, it is very philosophically interesting. And I haven't looked into this much yet, but I want to look into it more, because I haven't really taken it seriously before, but I'm more interested in it now. So, well, like, what do you think? Do you think the universe is conscious, that every single thing, even matter in the universe, is conscious, and conscious matter creates conscious creatures and conscious beings? Or do you think that it's unconscious matter that leads to conscious beings? Or what even is consciousness? Because we can never agree on what consciousness is, which to me is the real reason that consciousness is the hard problem, because people can never even really agree on the definition. Philosophers have so many different definitions of consciousness. But anyway, so it is interesting, though. Rupert Sheldrake explains panpsychism, that even unconscious matter that is conscious, that physical reality itself, without the existence of human beings or any other conscious creatures, reality itself is conscious.